So first, I want to thank the committee to the opportunity to be here with you, and without further ado, as time is ticking, I will begin my presentation, which will focus on visual culture and royal patronage under the reign of King John V, King of Portugal. So give me just one sec. So, as I was saying, in the 1707, John V became king, inheriting the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the major conflicts of the early 18th century. So the war was pacified with the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt, as we know, allowing John V to pursue a neutral policy and restore relations with monarchies whose alliance with Portugal would strengthen its sovereignty. We must remember that Portugal was ruled by Spain from 1518 to 1640, and so the kingdom was still asserting its relevance. So in this context, John the Fifth focused on two main strategies. First, it was crucial to strengthen the diplomatic relations with the Holy See to achieve parity with other leading Catholic monarchies. We must not forget that it was only under the John the Fifth's father, Peter II, that the Holy See recognized the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Portugal, and all of this was still very recent for the kingdom. So second, the king sought to align Portugal with other Catholic crowns such as Spain, and he married his child princess Maria Barbara with the Spanish prince Don Fernando, and the Spanish princess with the Portuguese prince Don José. And of course, he wanted to bound with France, and we'll see specifically why. In this context, John V understood the importance of not just copying the appearance of influential figures, but also to finding the most famous artworks and artists of its time. And one such prominent figure whose imagery played a crucial role in shaping the visual identity of John V's reign was Maximilian II, Emmanuel, Elector of Bavaria. So Maximilian was a pivotal figure who reshaped the political panorama of the late 17th and early 18th centuries, particularly celebrated for his military campaigns against the so-called Turks. If you note the shield with the crescent moon on the engraving, you can easily infer that. So, but why the Elector of Bavaria? We must remember that one of the key events that elevated Portugal as a significant monarchy was its participation in the Battle of the Cape Matapan. This naval battle, depicted on the backgrounds of the king's portrait, sought to stop the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which at the time posed a serious threat to Venetian possessions. So in response to the Pope's appeal for assistance from Catholic powers, France, Malta, Florence, among others, Portugal joined the effort. And the Turkish forces were neutralized, and the Pope acknowledged Portugal's vital contribution by elevating the kingdom's capital to a patriarchate, placing it on par with Venice and Rome. So the resemblance is clear. Just as the Elector of Bavaria sought to establish himself as a bulwark against the enemies of the true faith, as it was said, so did John V. And the triumph over the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of the Cape Matapan, largely achieved through John V's military support, can be seen as a continuation of the mission undertaken by the Christendom's defenders, exemplified by the Elector of Bavaria. And this connection played an important role in shaping the king's image. In fact, some of John V's portraits drew inspiration from the famous portrait of the Elector of Bavaria. But how did this process come about? So firstly, it is well documented that the Elector of Bavaria made great efforts to cultivate and promote his own image. And in 1689, he was portrayed by Joseph Vivian, his official painter, who then painted several copies of this portrait. And the oldest one among these is one of the Louvre Museum, and some of them were offered by the Elector of Bavaria himself. So, sorry. Then he commissioned a significant amount of its engravings produced by notable artists such as Cornelis van Meluwen. And by 1704, 100 copies of these engravings were offered to the members of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in Paris. And those and others artists started to use them widely. And well, note that how the strength and militancy shown in the Elector of Bavaria's portrait are directly connected with John V in the engraving shown here. This engraving was part of the famous Recueil des portraits des personnes qui sont distinguées, an album featuring portraits of prominent figures of the time. And the album was so iconic that the sale was advertised in the Mercure de France in 1726. In this engraving, John V, one can read, "For kings bearing my name made it glorious, in bravery, wisdom, zeal, and vigilance. To honor my name and lineage worthily, I am wise, valiant, vigilant, and pious." It is clear that the king sought to portray himself as both as a valiant defender of the faith and pious ruler, echoing his role in the Battle of Cape Matapan and drawing inspiration from the Elector of Bavaria. Furthermore, John V sponsored works in which he honored Maximilian with the following words: "He, Maximilian, contributed meaningfully to the victory against the Turks in the 1687, as well as in other moments of great glory, which earned him great renown in Europe and will make his memory commendable in future centuries." Also, correspondence between John V and his agents, as well as art merchants across many courts, reveals that in 1723 the king commissioned certain key items for the Portuguese royal family, such as the first communion silver service for one of the Portuguese infante, to be modeled, copied after those of the Elector of Bavaria. He was called what we can call an influencer today, the Elector of Bavaria. More subtly, but no less meaningfully, the desire to establish parallels with the Elector is also evident in the portrait of the Prince John, the king's brother, who died in childhood, and how, through the depiction of a dog in the lower left corner, a detail directly borrowed from another portrait of the Elector of Bavaria. And this iconographic element, while we will not delve deeply into its symbolic analysis due to time constraints, demands different statues. It is a true icon. And to understand it, we must look back to Rubens, and particularly to his celebrated cycle of painting for Queen Maria de' Medici in France, who now displayed in the Louvre. Where the same dog is depicted. So this cycle, commissioned by the Queen Mother in the 1620s, include episodes from her life. And while we'll not analyze this painting in detail, it is worth highlighting their iconic statues, as they were widely admired on a global scale. They were mentioned in works like Roger de Pille, Abrégé de la vie des peintres, and by Polymetis, as we can see in the text. In Portugal, as in other courts, these paintings were well known, and as proved by a book published by João Francisco Barreto in 1642. So Rubens acquires no introduction. His works were praised worldwide, and John V himself was among the many collectors who desired Rubens' paintings for his own collection, as expressed in correspondence with his agents. And the Elector of Bavaria was also a renowned collector of Rubens, not only because his ancestors had commissioned the artist, but also because he personally acquired many of his paintings. And in 1698, he bought no less than 100 Flemish paintings, including works that once owned by the Rubens family. And note that the Rubens dog was also the Rubens dog, famous dog, also appears in the other paintings, such as the enigmatic L'Enseigne de Gersan, painted by Watteau in the 1720s. So Ruben dogs was quite literally in vogue. And so we ask, was John V aware of this? How did he come in contact with the painting of the coronation of Maria de Medicis? Can we confirm that he did? And please note the following letter written by one of the king's marchands. A few days ago, I found it in the possession of a private individual, a collection of engravings based on the originals by Rubens. It seemed to me that they should be added to His Majesty collections of prints, which is being continued in Paris. I asked Mariette how much should be paid for them. He replied 2,000 French livres, because a collection like this is not to be found. After much negotiation, I also bought the prints of the paintings in the Luxembourg Gallery, as they are by the same author and among his best works, even though they were more expensive than those sold in Paris, because they are the first proofs which are no longer available today. This will be one of the finest collections of His Majesty Library, owing to the excellence of the author. So there is no doubt John V was aware of its importance. Has some documents preserved in Portugal trace the history of these commissions. So confirming that this portrait, which reproduces Rubens' dog, was painted between 1727 and 1729, after the kings received Rubens' print. So it served to understand when the work was done. We didn't know. So beyond the Elector of Bavaria, John V sought to emulate the kings of France, as did other monarchies of his time. And this ambition is particularly evident in the portrait of Joseph I, Prince of Portugal and John V's successor. The portrait notably draws inspiration from other of Louis XV, painted by Jean-Baptiste Valnoux in 1727, as can be seen here. In fact, we could even claim that this portrait of Louis XV influenced many other figures of his time. I'm sorry. And even beyond his time. And all of this seems to have been carefully planned. First of all, we know that the king used the Mercure de France to promote not only the portrait, but also the prints that were published and sold in Paris with great success. We know that Louis XV offered copies of his portrait to some prominent figures, when one of them was Portuguese. But however, consider this: although it's attempting to claim that the portrait of Prince José of Portugal is almost an exact copy of the famous engraving, there are some iconographic elements that differ. First, the ermine cloak on the credenza. And this doesn't surprise us. The French king cloak is decorated with a fleur de lis, while the Portuguese cloak is dyed red, as are those of Portuguese royal family. And however, notice the wig of both young men. And I'm just finished the presentation now. Louis XV wig is short, following the current fashion in France. And Prince Joseph, on the other hand, is long. And why then was this somewhat outdated wig style chosen? So let us focus on the letter of the Portuguese ambassador in Paris, Luís de Cunha, to the most Christian King Louis XV. They recognize his lack of manners. On Tuesday morning, I was in the king's chamber, and he got out of the bed. He noticed too many unfamiliar faces among the servants, and after washing his hands with them still wet, he shook them and splashed everyone standing around him in a circle. Some of his servants appeared embarrassed. One of them was the Duke of Trèves, a gentleman of the chamber. He still wore his large old-fashioned wig in the style of Louis XIV, and at one point Louis XV remarked that the next day he would no longer wear such a large wig. This somewhat tense situation clearly illustrates that the importance of fashion and how the king was perceived in the early years of his reign, still in his youth, as we know. Furthermore, in another letter concerning some commissions for John V of Portugal, we read the following: Your Excellency, will order all of them wigs in the style worn by Louis the XIV, but adapted to the fashion currently used at his court. Not the style worn by the new king, as he is still a child, but rather that the one typically worn by other princes of this court. So we see that's the reason why the Portuguese court annuls the presence of the short wig. It was it has to do with the king's young and lack of knowledge to governance the king. And so I will now end my presentation since the time is ticking. So thank you very much.